Our next guest has written a book called Blind Man's Bluff. He pretended he wasn't sight impaired at all, although his field of vision is an indistinct kaleidoscope of shifting shapes and changing colours. Imagine a movie filled only with extras, he writes, a meal with the only ingredients being herbs and a dash of salt. At age 16, James Tate Hill was diagnosed with Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. He has previously written Academy Gothic, winner of the Nilsson Prize for a first novel. Hi, James.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for having me on.
Lovely to talk to you. If you were here in person, not on Skype, and this is what everyone asks you, I suppose, what would you see looking at me from the other side of the desk?
Probably a blur with the shape of a seated man.
Okay.
And I would immediately in my mind try to guess your age and facial contours based on nothing but your voice. And it would be a pretty inaccurate guess, perhaps. Even if I cast my gaze all the way to the ceiling, I would see a less blurry outline of you, but my peripheral vision is still quite a bit affected by the blind spots. And as I also describe in the book, the further out into your peripheral vision you go, the larger something has to be just to notice it, let alone to see it with any acuity.
That dawning realization at age 16, how did it come to you? When did you know? Because eye tests earlier had said one eye was good, and then there were frightening moments driving. I'm interested in the onset because that must have been, well, it was slow, but it was traumatic.
Yeah. I had just gotten my driver's license when my optometrist described me as a monocular patient, but, I could still see fine out of the other eye. So I'm like, let's get back on the road. And like many rare conditions, it took a series of, 5, 6, 7 months to eventually land on what it was through a process of elimination.
And you had hope. Your parents actually sound like great people in this book, and they aren't rich, but they commit to sending you to Japan with your mum on the smell of an oily rag, really, to access a drug that might help.
We went over to Japan to get this experimental medication that really did nothing, except maybe give me an extra year or two of false hope that the vision might be improved or restored. For the first year and a half of the vision loss, I just kept waiting for these special magic pills to kick in and return my sight to me.
Yeah, that's sad. And you were determined that others would not know, which is at the core of your book, James. Why?
The short answer just goes back to a few precipitating events. My senior year of high school, my two best friends remained my two best friends, but all my friends with whom I wasn't as close became acquaintances, and all the acquaintances became strangers, and I was no longer able to look for people in the cafeteria and wasn't sure where to sit in the library or find people, and you realize quickly when you're not finding people, many people are not looking for or finding you. And so the amount of people that I let in became very limited, and it became difficult for me to open up to people and make friends until college. And I guess the other big precipitating event was starting to see the lower expectations that people had. One of the common synonyms for ignorance is blind, and there's no coincidence that a lot of people view people with disabilities or blindness as inferior. You can call it ableism, you can call it inhumanity, you can call it what you want, but we met with a disability counselor at the giant university I was going to attend, and I described this scene in the book of him telling me the best gift I could give my parents that first semester of college was a report card of straight C's. And even though I I had settled into a lazy B average. My parents still remembered me very, very fondly as the kid from elementary school who had been declared gifted and moved ahead a grade.
That's quite a passage in your book when he says that, and you change universities on that basis, don't you?
Yeah, we are on the way home and decide, my parents decide they're perhaps even more disgusted than me. They see a sign, a billboard on the interstate driving home for another college, and we just stop off there, and it's much, much smaller, and the disability counselor there, she speaks to me rather than to my parents. You realize so often when someone isn't talking to you or regards you as invisible when you can't see them, and it was such a refreshing change.
Yes, and people try their best for you on campus with varying degrees of success. In classes, you could have used a kind of telescope that you had to see things, but you just wouldn't let your classmates know for a long time that there was anything amiss.
It quickly became useless because the vision continued to deteriorate, but you're right. Just feeling like everybody's eyes were on me, even though in most cases they probably weren't.
You describe your disappearing world so well. Your relationships with women, when you start having them, are second only to sight loss in terms of trauma in this book. You just don't know what's going on really on dates. And social gatherings you describe as a gauntlet of horror at one point. So it's been a sudden shift down in gears, hasn't it, from driving around in a Ford Mustang to floundering around in the normal world we take for granted.
Yeah, and what I found was one of the ways to relieve that stress or tension or trauma was to simply remove myself from as many of those situations as possible. Start eating lunches in college in my dorm room, and especially after college in my first graduate program where I didn't make any friends in the city and just spent more and more time in my apartment. It didn't necessarily feel like isolation. It just felt like shrinking my world into a manageable size.
Yeah. And you don't know how other people are seeing you, because in your book, a young woman tells you she never guessed you were blind. She just thought you were what, James?
Am I allowed to say this?
Yeah, you can.
All right. Yeah. She says, I never realized you were blind. I just thought you were an asshole.
Yeah.
And I remembered being so pleased at this because by now I was a senior in college, and I thought, wow, I've gotten away with it. I have, very few friends, and strangers never stop me to talk. And but that was the victory. That was the victory, was how awful to have been seen as somebody with a disability or as somebody who is blind. It was so much better to be seen as aloof or indifferent or a jerk. I like to think that my eye contact skills were a little better because I can, if I'm close enough to somebody, I can fixate on the place where the eyes should be and simulate eye contact. I would adopt this very deliberate look of concentration, looking off to the side. Oh, I must be deep in thought because, you never looked at me. I waved to you, but I was just thinking about that paper I have to write. Sure.
This is so interesting because it's a memoir of a young life that's not just American, because its setting and its events will be familiar to anyone who's been to a New Zealand university, and you are negotiating, socializing, coursework, romance. The difference is that you're feeling your way through it so differently. You're normal on the outside, but completely unable to do much compared with previously. And minute by minute on campus, hour by hour, you remember what everyday sighted life is like and kind of behave accordingly, but at the same time, it's like a paper bag's been put over your head.
Yeah, I kept assuming I was living the same life and doing everything that I could do by ear or by touch or by the limited amount of vision I had, and just continuing to play the same game with a broken remote controller. if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Not surprisingly. James Tate Hill is with us. Blind Man's Bluff is his book. And in classes, you pretend to take notes. You're just writing screeds of gibberish. I was struck.
Yes.
I was struck by a short passage where you explain, James, why you won't go to a bar with your mates because so much can go wrong for you in a pub.
Yeah. The loud music is the biggest barrier, and I obviously am using my ears to keep track of voices and where people are, keeping track of people based on patterns of shirts or voices, and eventually I'm going to have to go to the men's room. How am I going to get there?
And there's one part of the book, I forget the circumstances, but just a passing tray when someone offers you a biscuit or whatever, you know, there's such uncertainty in your head about reaching out and doing that right and making a success of the simplest sorts of things.
Yeah, am I going to reach for the wrong area of the plate? Am I going to dip my finger into the dip? And so it's so much less stressful to just, no, thank you. No, I'm fine. I'm going to sip my drink.
You lined the shelves in your apartment with books you couldn't read, and your talking books were hidden under the bed because people would judge you. You see, we're judging you for not coming clean on all this, but we understand as well because we are a cruel species, aren't we? There are lovely people, but we're also cruel.
Yeah, for all the friends who would have been so completely welcoming of my truest self and had probably tried to get me to open up over the years, there was always somebody who either refused to talk to me, even if there were only 3 of us in the room, or somebody who in high school would make a comment that I hadn't shaved because I could no longer see my face, or the comments in situation comedies about audiobooks being inferior to regular books, that they're not really reading. And there are still plenty of biases against audiobooks now, even though they're far more popular than they were when I started reading them 30 years ago.
The paradox of your new life is that going blind made you a reader and a writer, James.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot in your book about the advances in technology that gradually allowed you to sort of read and then to write. Can you tell us how you write now as an author?
So it was really not until my second graduate program when I started using what I use now, which is screen reader technology. And there's, at this point, several types of effective screen reading technologies that will read you what's on the screen and will allow you to navigate the screen the way that a mouse would.
So we haven't got to your change of heart yet, but your first wife, Meredith, tells you over the phone she won't be complicit in your lie anymore.
I was lying to her about who I was and what I could do in the early going, and perhaps it was a way of tricking her into thinking I was a different person, or that she was going to be living a different life than she was going to be living. And ultimately, we ended up walking on the same eggshells, as I'm trying so diligently not to let her know what I can't do, because she becomes increasingly frustrated with things that I will inevitably need assistance with. And so we end up, neither of us ever really broaching the subject of my blindness until it's really too late.
Yes. But there are comparisons in many lives with that experience of yours, just different kinds of comparisons. I think we understand, right from the get-go, your reluctance to accept that new life that you were afflicted with. So when did it all change for you?
Meredith and I got divorced. I become underemployed and have to file for disability. And I am living in this very old apartment with slanted floors and loud radiators, and I am watching movies at all hours because I cannot sleep. And I'm asking myself, how did I get here? How did I end up in a much lonelier place than I had been even 10 years ago when I thought I was at my loneliest?
Yeah.
And so I'm starting to have those internal epiphanies that this is maybe not worth hiding anymore, but I'm never going to be compatible with anybody in a long-term relationship if the person I present to them is not the person who will eventually be revealed years later.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of online dating, and it's humorous as well. It shouldn't be, because it's it's a parlous situation for you, and nerve-wracking, but it's warm and funny at the same time, actually.
Yeah, I hope, especially that chapter, but I think throughout, humor was what really allowed me to tell this story for the first time.
But your book does have a happy ending, so why has Laurie worked out in your life when Meredith and Rebecca, who we haven't talked about, did not?
I think a lot of it was me and the self-acceptance that I was ready for. But she is also somebody who has lived a very full life and as they say in therapy, done a lot of work on herself. She is somebody who is very emotionally sophisticated, and somebody who did not let me get away with what I tried to hide. I'm in one of these formerly stressful situations at the supermarket, picking things out and asking for her help, and I find myself offering my traditional apologies for how hard it is to find my toothpaste or my mouthwash, and she just turns to me and says, "Why are you apologizing?" And it really sinks in that I am with somebody for whom I do not have to apologize for what I can't be or do.
Yeah. That's a lovely, lovely moment, actually. We're talking with James Tate Hill, Blind Man's Bluff. So your days now, can you describe them?
I teach 3 days a week. I try and focus on my writing the other 2 days, but the teaching is so much more rewarding now because I can... Back in the day, I would not be open with my students. This is described with painful and humorous detail in the book of the lengths I went to make sure they didn't know what I couldn't see. I was so fearful of what kind of opinion they would have of their teacher if I was honest with them about not being able to see their hands go up in the classroom. So I would create these stories of, well, in the real world, you're never going to raise your hand, so let's not raise our hands in here. And now I just say, I can't see your hand go up, so if you hold your hand up, would somebody next to you please poke them and say, he can't see your hand go up, just shout out your question.
Out of interest, how rare is Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy? Good
question, and I'm glad I looked this up a few weeks ago. It is. I only knew at the time that it was exceedingly rare, 1 in 30,000 to 1 in 50,000.
Right. Gee, actually, that adds up to quite a lot of people in the world.
Yeah, it's not. There are lots of groups on social media, and it's being studied a little bit more than it used to be with the progress that's been made in gene therapy.
I won't give away the ending of your book because it's quite joyous. But it's a very fine memoir and amazingly relatable for sighted people with great insights into a world like yours. And also, James, it's a book that will make a big difference in the lives of people who read it. And what more can a writer want, really?
I could not possibly want more than what you just said. That makes me very happy to hear that it is resonant because we're writing, whenever anybody writes a memoir, your life experience, your lived experience feels so specific, and you just hope that the emotions are universal.
Keep the books coming, James. Congratulations on this one. Very nice of you to give us your time.
I couldn't be happier to be talking with you, Jim. Thank you.
James Tate Hill, Blind Man's Bluff.